urbanization strategies, Beijing Olympic robotics, and what intrigued us most at CES. That's all ahead on this week's Monday Minute. Monday Minute works like this. We're going to ask each other 5 questions about the 5 top headlines from the last week. Are you ready? Let's go.
All right, Carl, the first question this week is for you. Starbucks was covered in a really cool video the Wall Street Journal did, highlighting just the history of how their digital platform came to life. They started in 2009, unbelievably early for what's been going on in the industry, just a massive amount of foresight there. But they shared some interesting statistics. Care to share them?
Absolutely. The 2009, I think, is the interesting one, first of all, though, right? The fact that they've been at this for quite a long period of time tells us that while they still set the benchmark in many ways of having a digital ordering platform, a loyalty platform, and payment all in one app, that really is very much the model that many try to work to today. But there's more. On that video, Heather Haddon of the Wall Street Journal, she shared that they have $3 billion loaded on gift cards. Isn't that crazy? And when you look at that, that's about 2.4 billion in cash that they have on their balance sheet. And that number exceeds many banks in the US. And so at a time when restaurants continue to struggle, it just strikes me, with cash being king, this is a really important strategy for even the smallest of businesses to make sure they have some form of gift card strategy, to build it into their marketing, and to recognize that it's important from a digital perspective too. The other thing which I thought was fascinating was, do you know the amount of product combinations that they do? 170,000 different types of drinks they've calculated. And that's crazy when you think about that, because we see the menus, and of course they do have a number of different varieties. But I think it points to the fact that people like to have their beverages at a Starbucks their way. And I think, again, restaurants of all types can think about that in the way in which they design their menu and the customization possibilities, because that variety clearly is why Starbucks are now second only to McDonald's in terms of market cap, in terms of size around the world, which was another stat. In 2021, mobile interactions accounted for nearly a quarter of their transactions. So it shows, just even in 2021, how much their app is such an important part of their business. And then before the pandemic, 80% of their transactions were either done through a drive-through or through mobile order pickups. So all of the themes that we've been talking about here on the Monday Minute are coming through in one of the giants in this space, but those themes are lessons that I think even the smallest of restaurants can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking to Sean Walchef earlier this week, and he was telling us about getting paid before the food goes out the door, and Toast prepayment feature enabling that. He's an independent restaurant, and he's taken a lesson straight from Starbucks.
Okay, our second question is about a number of things, actually. We saw TGI Fridays launch their Fridays on the Fly format. We saw that Reef are partnering with Denny's. And it struck me that we should perhaps have a think about this in the sense of how these established brands are perhaps altering their marketing planning strategy, their market planning strategy, and moving away from their kind of suburban roots. What thoughts do you have about this, especially given your history in this space?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here. The first is very similar to what we saw in, say, the fitness space as we move from, giant 24-hour fitnesses to tiny boutique fitness, which is just that a large footprint is expensive. And as consumers are less likely to want to be in said large footprint, it is so much easier to make the returns model work when you're doing something very small. So that's certainly one thing that's going on here. And the other thing that I think is happening is, even as, COVID kind of put a pause on this trend, America is in a long-term shift to a much more dense living model. And historically, we've been all about the suburban growth, expanding, forever out into the farms. And that's really where we got a lot of these fast food and casual dining brands, where they take up a lot of space and they each have their own dedicated footprint. Those brands actually did very well during COVID because they were in places where consumers felt more safe and they were more distributed. Having said that, there has been a long-term trend toward number one, younger people especially moving into more urban environments. So if you travel around the US, you're going to see a bunch of cranes downtown. And I think we'll come back to that, even if it has been paused a little bit during COVID. And then number two, even within suburban America, those suburbs are getting more dense. And, we've talked about this before with the book Big Shifts Ahead, where they talk about suburban environments, which are suburban like, but they have little urban downtown centers, and they feel very different from places where you could have a 6,000 square foot single story restaurant with a sea of parking around it. So as America starts to change, the restaurants have to change too and have to figure out models that work in more urban environments and models that work even in these kind of more dense suburban slash suburban environments. So, all right. So, the Beijing Olympics are serving up food differently this year. Is it a gimmick or is it a real pathway to alternative serving?
Yeah, let's start this by showing you a video of what you mean by this. All right. So pretty interesting, huh? Now clearly journalists being invited to see that is a PR stunt, if you will, but it does go to show for me just the ways in which automation continues to be something that's very front and center of the new type of dining experience. I'm excited to see them trying this. I think it's great to be able to see how they've combined not only the robotic element of creating things like burgers, pizzas, and various different cocktails, I believe, for those that are going to be visiting a part of the Olympic Village, but also the angle of how the food is delivered to the table as well. We've seen plenty of those robots taking it from the kitchen through to the table on one of the kind of automated devices there, but actually coming from the ceiling, as we saw in that last video, is another kind of angle. I suspect it's pretty expensive, Meredith. I don't know what your thoughts are with your old real estate hats on, but it certainly does demonstrate a level of theatre and entertainment. It creates more of an experiential environment. So it wouldn't surprise me if we did see this in certainly high volume locations, but it would really need to be a high volume location to make it work on a mainstream kind of basis, I'd suggest. Okay, let's go to question 4. So Foxtrot brought in $100 million in Series C funding, and they're expecting to open up 25 new locations in 2022. So what do you think differentiates them from the typical convenience store?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting because, like folks like GoPuff or DashMart, this is really a tech-enabled delivery business, but they're very different in that they're going after a unique niche. They have a very curated selection. For those who've been in the store, who have not been in the store, it's much more focused on high-end, unique items that maybe you couldn't find anywhere else locally. It feels like a high-end market, and a lot of wine, a lot of prepared foods, a lot of things, cheese, charcuterie plates, things that are a little bit fancy. And I think what makes this interesting, therefore, is that it shows how you can use this delivery environment to go after segments that maybe you couldn't do if you were just building a store. Fascinating. So now, will that segmentation probably limit them in the end? Yes, but I think certainly they can have 22 more stores and probably a lot more after that. All right, last question. So CES this year in Vegas had a number of themes that were food related. Tell us about them.
Well, I, for one, must get to CES because this is kind of my place to be. I love all the things that come out of CES, not just in a food context. But the first thing I'd say is, isn't it great that restaurants were there? I mean, the fact that restaurants are now in a place which is seen as the forum for digital innovation across every kind of industry, now restaurants being there just shows how far we've come in the last few years. And the headline that stood out for me, Meredith, was about a company called Beyond Honeycomb. Now, what they are talking about is the ability to learn a recipe through AI over 48 hours and to be able to put that into practice so that a robotic chef, if you will, a robot will be able to then recreate that dish. And it's doing it through molecular sensing through the kitchen utensils. Wow, right? Have you heard of anything like this before? I certainly haven't. Now, this is a South Korean company. Supposedly, this is already in situ over in South Korea, and so it's already happening. It's not just a dream of something that someone has dreamt up, but actually it is happening. And I think this, again, demonstrates the way in which the digitization and robotics and AI kind of agenda comes together to help restaurant executives think about how they can scale concepts quickly. Anything new that you put into certainly a big multi-unit environment is tough to actually introduce, and it's very kind of complicated. So therefore, if you could come up with a brand new recipe and put that into your entire network within, let's say, a week, that would just be like it'll blow the kind of socks off most kind of any food teams out there, and certainly the operators that struggle to ensure a consistent execution as well. So let's keep an eye out for Beyond Honeycomb, because I think if that is something that is actually happening now over in South Korea, it won't be long before we see similar technology appearing in restaurants over here in the US. Okay, well, that's it for this week's Monday Minute. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. And as ever, there's a huge amount of headlines and news out there in this space that we try to choose from. But please leave your questions, your comments, anything that you've agreed with or disagreed with from today's edition. And we look forward to welcoming you back next week for the next Monday Minute. Thanks for watching. The Monday Minute is available for you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Watch us on YouTube and follow us on all our social media Learn.Delivery channels. Thanks for listening.